A federal jury reached a verdict yesterday in the high-profile Oath Keepers trial. Oath Keepers founder Stewart Rhodes and the leader of the Florida chapter of the far-right group, Kelly Meggs, were both found guilty of seditious conspiracy in connection with the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol. The seditious conspiracy charge carries a maximum of 20 years in prison. Rhodes' attorney said they plan to appeal the conviction. This is the most serious case to grow out of the Justice Department's sprawling investigation into the U.S. Capitol insurrection. The trial lasted 8 weeks, with the jury deliberating for 3 days. 3 other members of the group were found not guilty on seditious conspiracy. That charge, they include Jessica Watkins, Kenneth Harrelson, and Thomas Caldwell. All 5 were found guilty of obstruction of an official proceeding and aiding and abetting for their actions on January 6th. A sentencing date has not been set yet. Federal prosecutors allege the 5 defendants conspired to oppose the peaceful transfer of power from former President Donald Trump to President Joe Biden. Attorney General Merrick Garland released a statement praising the work of prosecutors and federal agents, affirming that the Justice Department is, quote, committed to holding accountable those criminally responsible for the assault on our democracy on January 6, 2021.
Elise Jordan, obviously not easy to get this charge. A big win.
Seditious conspiracy.
Seditious conspiracy. A big win for prosecutors and a big win for Americans who were shocked and outraged by what happened on January the 6th. And let me just say, a huge loss for those right-wing Trumpers, the Trumpiest of the right-wing Trumpers in the chattering classes that kept saying, oh, wait a second, it wasn't an insurrection. If it were an insurrection, these people would be charged and found guilty of seditious conspiracy. Well, they were, and here we are, and it was an insurrection, according to juries, unless they want to nullify juries now.
Well, and what you hear from a lot of Trump supporters who defend what happened on January 6th is that so many of the insurrectionists are being held now as political prisoners. Well, this goes to the very top of the operation, seditious conspiracy, which is a pretty heavy charge when you think about the gravity of what happened that day and the attempt to overturn the government. And so now going forward, what does this mean for all of the other men and women who were there that day and who breached police boundaries, who went into areas of the Capitol that they weren't supposed to go into? What does this mean now?
Let's turn to some of our reporters on this story. Former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, now on NBC News, and MSNBC legal analyst Glenn Kirshner, and NBC News justice reporter Ryan Riley. Guys, good morning. Ryan, let me start with you. You've been covering this case so closely. Both of you were in the courtroom, actually, for most of this trial. So, Ryan, how did the verdicts that you saw yesterday and heard line up with what you expected?
I definitely was expecting Stewart Rhodes to catch the seditious conspiracy verdict. I think that, actually the split verdict here sort of goes to the credibility of the jury and of the verdict, because we've seen a lot of attacks on D.C. jurors in a lot of court filings from January 6th defendants saying that they're too biased, they're too left-leaning to handle these cases and decide them fairly. But, they didn't give DOJ everything they wanted here. They looked at the evidence, applied the facts and the evidence, and came up with this mixed verdict. Finding 2 individuals were guilty of seditious conspiracy, but that three of them weren't. And I just think it's a well-reasoned and logical verdict that really does show that, jurors took their duty here seriously and looked at what the judge instructed them to do, looked at the evidence that was available to them, and decided that there was enough evidence to find at least 2 of these individuals guilty of seditious conspiracy. So a big win for DOJ here overall. And, seditious conspiracy is something that hasn't hasn't been seen in D.C. for decades, and it's been more than a decade since the last time the Justice Department tried this, and in that case, they didn't succeed. So, they took a big shot here, and I think that, this is over at Main Justice at DOJ headquarters. I think they're chalking this one up to a win, and it's, not great news necessarily for individuals who are still facing these seditious conspiracy charges, including other members of the Oath Keepers whose trial is coming up, as well as members of the Proud Boys who also are facing that charge and will be going to trial here in the coming weeks.
Glenn, the Oath Keepers, as you know, have compared themselves to the founding fathers fighting tyranny. They said this was their Bastille moment, comparing themselves to French revolutionaries. We know that they had weapons, huge caches of weapons at a Comfort Inn in Arlington, Virginia. In case it came to that, they'd have boats at the ready to go in. They were role-playing. They thought they were revolutionaries. What message does this verdict send to them?
Yeah, Willie, criminal trials are not supposed to be political endeavors. The question for the jury exclusively is whether the evidence introduced at trial proves the charged offenses beyond a reasonable doubt. And I will say the prosecutors did a pretty good job at keeping politics out of the trial. Rarely did you hear a prosecutor even utter the name Donald Trump. But then the head of the Oath Keepers and the lead defendant, Elmer Stewart Rhodes, took the stand and blew it all up. Now, it's rare for defendants to take the stand in, large federal prosecutions. I've had some of my defendants take the stand, which, was always a happy time for me because I got to cross-examine them. But when Rhodes took the stand very early on in his lengthy testimony, he said, and I quote, "The election was unconstitutional," said the disbarred Yale lawyer. And he also helpfully added that he is a constitutional expert. I don't think he won any points with the jury. But once he did that, Willie, he really put the big lie on trial. So ultimately, I view the jury's verdict not only as an affirmation that the evidence proved the guilt of these 5 defendants beyond a reasonable doubt, but it was a pretty direct rejection of the big lie itself. In short, I think the verdicts were a victory of law, the rule of law, over lawlessness, and a victory of facts over, I guess, alternative facts.